So unless EA Dice are going to pull the proverbial rabbit out of their hat and surprise us all, it seems all but confirmed now that this year's Battlefield title is going to be World War II. Now, it's possible, of course, they're going to opt for an interesting alternate man in the high castle timeline or any number of other mysterious options. But I doubt it. We will see though. Still, I always like to think about what could have been because it's fun. Now, here are 5 options for settings of Battlefield 5 that I think would be better than just it's World War II again. A futuristic war of attrition is the first thing that always comes to my mind, a future global war, and in this scenario the setting for the game could be during or toward the end of a future World War III. It would be perhaps more into the future than you might imagine, but futuristic doesn't always have to mean wall running and giant mechs. My preferred vision of a future like this is humanity barely holding on, diminished resources with 2 factions battling for control of the bare remnants of society. And with this setting, it would give DICE a huge range of options from interesting political narratives and flashbacks for stories. You can have excellent multiplayer map settings of destroyed but familiar global locations, which are always really poignant. You could have a full catalogue of weapons, modern and old. Customization could be immensely varied and even improvised. This future war would be one of attrition, and that's where people are grinding down against each other in a battle to the bitter end with ever diminishing resources. And this bleak, nightmarish reality would give an immense amount of freedom and creative options for the game. It's something that I would love to see played out. The scenery and backdrop of this game would be your classic environmental complete collapse, combined with warfare that has been dragging on and on. This would be a situation where perhaps modern hardware has become unsustainable, and so you are back to almost a World War I style of combat, but with modern weapons also thrown into the mix. Then combine this with more creative and adaptive guerrilla and resistance factions, and then you've got a plethora of avenues to take when it comes to environment and equipment. Okay, an alternate World War II history. This is a very obvious one and probably one that everybody thinks of straight away, but it would still be a good thing to do, and it is even still a possibility, but it does give a lot of scope for invention. Wolfenstein 2014, subsequent sequels have covered this concept to a solid degree, but you have plenty of other material like, of course, Philip K. Dick's Man in the High Castle and other novels like Robert Harris's Fatherland. The list actually goes on and on there. A lot of people have talked about this issue, but there is actually very interesting evidence that I'll go into perhaps another day that did actually demonstrate the Nazis in World War II were very close to developing technology that could have potentially won them the war and even been able to strike the west coast of the US. So going down this path obviously opens up many interesting possibilities if you tweak the timeline even a small amount, where perhaps the US has had to retreat to its own shores and abandon Europe. Maybe then the conflict would focus more on a concentrated battle as well between Russia and Germany, where Britain has already been completely invaded by Germany. Again, great many options here for how the narrative could play out. When it comes to the game itself, you could roll forward a few years and naturally advance the tech options to that end, as well as playing out some interesting locations we know from history that should have been very different at that point in time. You could even roll forward to having German forces have reached the US and are fighting it out on the east coast. The scenery and backdrop of this game could be obviously global. Strong, evocative imagery of UK, US cities facing war or having been run over by war. Scenarios in this period that it's never actually been exposed to always gets people's imagination racing. Not to mention, of course, very evocative imagery and icons. Blending 1940s tech with more modern upgrades could make for some really interesting hardware adaptations and still keep things familiar enough as to connect them with the past. Battlefield 2192. Now, one that's probably going to make people knee-jerk straight away is if it were more like a cyberpunk future. Something akin to Blade Runner, Altered Carbon, a world with elements of Akira, Ghost in the Shell. But first off, just to say, cyberpunk tends to conjure images of people wearing crazy outfits, bright colours and all this kind of stuff. But cyberpunk, what it means is it's really just a subgenre of science fiction that focuses on the common people, but with also high tech going on. It usually has a focus on AI, cybernetic enhancement, body modification, that kind of thing. So where could this go for a Battlefield game? Now, many people have lamented the slim chances of Battlefield ever returning to the game 2142, and while this game would perhaps not be a direct sequel, it could move forward in time and give a nod in the direction of 2142. This Battlefield game depicted a war in the 22nd century where the EU and PAC, the Pan-Asian Coalition, battled for remaining land during a new ice age, and it deals with the ideas of civilian displacement as well as battling for diminishing resources, which is always a really common theme. Now you could step forward and roll the timeline on, say, 50 years, where things have become significantly worse, and perhaps the factions have now fragmented further as areas around the world try to move or deal with their own issues. And this would certainly be a game with more future tech, but it could be more like a combined high and low tech, and a focus more on the common soldiers and less on a grandiose factional battle. That would simply be the background narrative that frames it all. Then you could blend in the cyberpunk cybernetic enhancement stuff, where perhaps because of environmental conditions, people have had to modify and have other elements going on with them, and that would be a stylistic thing. This game could feature epic cold winter styled gear. If you wanted some clickbait gimmicky stuff, you've got that in the form of your mechs, and maybe they're still old but very, very powerful. Plus, as per usual, you've got the option to create environments formed around familiar locations, as with the alternate World War II stuff that have been decimated, and in this case it would be by environmental change. The scenario and backdrop of this game would generally be speaking winter warfare, a lot of ice and tundra, units equipped as such. Think of something cross between maybe sort of the Division in urban areas with elements of Killzone going on, obvious Battlefield 2142 itself. It would be a futuristic but grounded situation. Perhaps the environment itself could actually become more of a thing and play some role in how units work or how objectives in modes work, where temperature control becomes a critical objective and something that you need to be aware of as a unit on the ground, so that you can't just kind of go out into unexposed area. You've got to use routes. That'd be a very cool way of keeping the battlefield looking and feeling open, but at the same time trying to channel people through areas where they can maintain more core temperature control, etc. A Battlefield Pacific War. A lot of people are often talking about wanting to see a Vietnam game. A more interesting direction to go in would be to take that sort of environment but then push it in terms of the narrative and general scale of it. So I always really enjoyed the background of Operation Flashpoint Dragon Rising, where the game dealt with a crisis themed around, again, resource control, pretty common in the sphere of why we have conflicts. Now in Dragon Rising you had China fighting against a combined Russian-US coalition. Take that concept, spin it out a bit, with different locations in a postmodern future, anywhere in the region from mainland China to Japan, Vietnam, even venturing even to parts of Russia, gives a large scope to build a game around a fictional conflict. This would be a near future environment, so it'd be reaching around the vibe of Battlefield 4, but taking it forward with updated graphics, more detailed levels of weapon and soldier customization. A very basic outline of a situation, but I think the setting and combination of forces alone would make it a very interesting title with plenty of room for imagination and creative development, both in gameplay and weaponry. The scenery and backdrop of this game is going to be fairly self-explanatory, so jungle terrain, coastal, military installations, artificially created islands, inland points of interest, archipelagos. There's plenty of scope for urban assaults in any number of well-known cities there. And then last on my list is the Middle East. This would probably be the most controversial and therefore unlikely of all the options, but it would also be one that had a ton of scope from a game's point of view. The Middle East region has unfortunately been in an ongoing state of conflict since, let's say, the 70s, but obviously before that as well. But let's take that period of the 70s. From a more modern point of view, let's say you start there. And this game could actually be an amazing educational tool to assist people in understanding one of the most complex and fractured conflict zones in modern history. The game could pan between different campaign missions running from the 70s, where the West was actually assisting the Taliban to fight the Soviets, and then you could progress forward through to things like the Gulf War, the invasion of Iraq, and modern day peacekeeping operations. And just because you'd be looking at those time periods, that's what makes it a more controversial option. Games also for some reason are really quick to explain that they aren't real life, and as such shouldn't be judged as being really controversial, yet simultaneously big AAA games tend to really shy away from these things, which I always find is weird, like a strange disparity. Focusing on the Middle East though in a Battlefield game could still provide a wide range of situations and environments, but having a connecting theme that runs throughout and ties it all together. You also have the benefit of being able to bring recognisable and well understood modern equipment into the mix. You remember that awesome jet operation from Battlefield 3 in the campaign? Well, think if that were reimagined to a modern day one featuring an A-10 in a Middle Eastern conflict zone supporting units' activity on the ground. You can just imagine how epic that could be. Helicopters also felt really neglected to me in Battlefield for some time, and this sort of situation could really bring that back in, give a role again to transporting people around a battlefield, as well as there being a role to play for support jets, which I dislike personally, but I know there's an appetite there for some people. In this kind of situation, you could have the scope and scale to be able to do that. Depending on how brave they were as well, you could even push this to perhaps an alternate modern day situation which isn't Syria, but read between the lines, where you've got Russia and the US embroiled in some ongoing conflict, and this could enable the game to host then at least 3 factions. This scenario and the backdrop of this game would make for very much a classic Middle Eastern cities. You've got oil fields, mountains, valleys, the small villages which make up the region. It's all very well established in people's minds, and it would very easily translate into another game. So those are just 5 ideas off the top of my head that would be, in my opinion, far preferable to just It's World War II. Regardless of what we actually end up with this year, because like I say, who knows if they're still going to be trolling everyone. Tell me your thoughts of what would be the best backdrop for a Battlefield game. This is Luton, I'll see you next time.